Hey, this is a very brief tutorial on the types and levels of data. My intention here is not to go that deeply. So if you do have any additional questions or there's something that you still want some clarification about, by all means, please let me know. The first type I'm going to talk about that you would have probably seen first in your text is nominal. It's also called the same thing frequently as categorical or qualitative. These are all basically different ways of saying the same thing. And as you could probably imagine, because one of the words is categorical, it's exactly like it sounds. Nominal data is used to describe people, places, things, events, etc., according to categories. So examples, probably some of the most common examples would be, gender, favorite color, nationality, all kinds of different things that we use in research. So let's talk about why the heck is it important to know that nominal data are categorical. Well, let's say that we were doing some kind of research based on, political affiliation. So I interview people of different political parties. So I've got Democrats, I've got Republicans, I've got my independents, and let's say Green Party. And sorry guys, my handwriting, not exactly the best, in case you haven't figured it out at this point. And by the way, I know there's more than 4 political parties. For simplicity's sake, we're just going to keep it here. So let's say I interviewed 20 Democrats, 24 Republicans. It turned out that 9 people were independents and 3 people were Green Party candidates. The reason it's important to know that this is nominal data is because I can't do some of the things that we have a tendency to want to do with data, like take the mean, median, mode. There's not a whole lot that I can really do with it when it comes to like a lot of the really cool things you can do with data analysis software. Pretty much the only things you can do with categorical data is you can either do frequency, which is really just kind of the big kid word for counting how many you've got. And of course you can do percentages, right? Like you can say this percentage was a Democrat. This percentage of interviewees were Republicans. So believe it or not, I know it sounds crazy, sometimes people try to do things even like highly qualified researchers sometimes try to do things with data they shouldn't do. And one of the things they try to do is taking the average of categories, believe it or not. So it's important to know that with nominal data, you can't do that. So if you ever see that in a study, you're going to want to think twice and be like, I better take a closer look at this and see if I'm really buying what these people are selling. The next type of data we'll discuss is ordinal, and it's frequently also called things, like rank. And an example might be, we do this a lot, like surveys where people rate like their levels of satisfaction, for instance. And ordinal, just as it implies, basically has to do with, the rank or order that the data falls into. So for example, say we've got a race, here we have our guy in first place. Here we have our guy in second place. Here we have our guy in third place. And what's important to know about ordinal data is that it doesn't necessarily have the same gap, right? So like these 2 girls have a bigger gap between second and third than there appears to be between first and second. Doesn't matter how much first place won by. All that's important is that this lady came in first, this lady came in second, this lady came in third. So there's not necessarily an even interval in between each order. And when that particularly comes into play, it really matters in things like social research. Like let's say you were working, or not even social research, say you're working for a company and you wanted to find out whether or not people think that your website has a user-friendly interface. Okay, so you give this survey. You can, and you frequently do see researchers assign numbers. This is something called a Likert scale. So that basically just means that your people are ranking their opinions one to the other. Again, very basic example. So sometimes you might see people say, all right, I'm going to say strongly disagree, has a level of 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. Okay, and frequently we'll do that. We'll assign a number value to the words to make it easier to analyze. But obviously, this person who disagrees versus the person who agrees, right? The person that agrees, just because there's a number 4 here doesn't mean that that person feels like twice as different, if that makes sense, about the user-friendly interface. It could be, like you can't really have an exact science. There might not necessarily be a very specific interval between the two. All you really know for sure is that this person like really agrees versus this person, just agrees somewhat. So you can't really say like whether the difference between strongly agree and agree is the same as it is between agree and neutral. So why does that matter? Even though in statistics, you will frequently see a lot of scientists actually will do statistical tests using scales like this, like agree, disagree. There are actually even, statisticians who don't necessarily agree. Some say this is horrible practice. You should never do like mean, median, mode, and range with ordinal data. So you've got some people out there that say, ordinal data, you should never, ever, ever, ever do mean, median, mode, range, stuff like that. There's another, stream of thought out there from other people, though, who say, yeah, but when you're doing experiments about human behavior, sometimes we need this information and sometimes it's okay. So, and I'm happy to direct you to more resources, but it's understanding why it's so confusing to people that are new at stats when even the quote unquote experts can't necessarily agree. So it's important to know that it's ordinal data because it's only dictated by order, but so what? It's important to know that there's disagreement about whether or not you can do certain tests with ordinal data. So again, your job here is to start reading research and trying to evaluate the quality of the research. It might be a legit question to say, I don't know that they should have used a mean, a median, or a mode here, for example. And you just have to know to be looking for things like that, even though even experts disagree. Okay, the final class that we're going to talk about is actually a combination of 2 classes, and then I'm going to talk about the difference between the 2 in the moment. But the short version of interval and ratio data is that both types of data can be weighed or measured. And you can have a couple of different types of interval or ratio data. Discrete data primarily involves whole numbers or things that can be counted. So frequently things like, your number of people. Okay, a good rule of thumb for discrete data is to think to yourself like, can I have 2.5 people? If you can't have 2.5 people, that means it's discrete. I'm going to count the number of bakeries on this street. Are you going to count 2.5 bakeries? Of course you're not, right? So that makes it discrete. Whereas continuous is something that the visual I always used to give myself is if I'm looking at a ruler, the reason it's continuous is because you can continue from like 1 inch to 2 inches to 3 inches, right? I can have 1.5 inches. I can have 1 3/4 inches. So basically, if it can be a fraction, and again, this is a very, very, very simplistic definition, but if it can be a fraction or a decimal, then it's going to be considered continuous. So if you ask yourself the question, can I have half, for example, can I have 1.5 people? Can I have 1.5 cars? Whatever. If your answer is no, then it's going to be discrete. Whereas if you can have a fraction or a decimal, more often than not, that is continuous data. Now, and again, interval and ratio data could be discrete or continuous, so I want to make sure that's important to notice, okay? You can have interval or ratio data that is discrete or continuous. So what the heck is the difference between interval versus ratio? And the key is that a ratio data has what we call a true zero. So a good way of thinking to yourself is, can I have none of this thing? And that is what makes it ratio. So let me give you just a very few examples. And this is the toughest one, again, even for social scientists, to sometimes agree. It's not that they don't know, it's honestly just that smart people kind of disagree. So an example might be an example of interval. Okay, because I guess you're kind of wondering, like, well, what would have like a not true zero? Because it's kind of easy to imagine what would have a true zero, right? Like no people, right? So your number of people is going to be ratio data because you can have no people, right? Well, an example of interval, well, what the heck would be, what doesn't have a zero? Well, so for example, there are a lot of IQ tests, for example, where there's actually no such thing as zero. Like you literally get some points for writing your name on there, for example. Another example that you'll see a lot is the Celsius temperature, because 0 degrees doesn't actually mean that there's no temperature. Okay, it just means that it's a certain measure of temperature. Now, what I need to be careful to make sure I point out to you, though, is that not all temperature is ratio data. So, for example, kelvins, there is actually in science, kelvins does have like a true zero. That is like a 0 degrees Kelvin is literally the absence of any temperature. So in that case, you do have a ratio version of temperature. So don't ever think, oh, it's temperature, it's automatically going to be interval, because that's not true. Another example might be like when you take, I'm sure you've heard example of interval, might be you've heard like when you take your SATs, right? When they're like, hey, you get 20 points just for writing your name on there. That's true. Okay, so the biggest thing I want to make sure, the biggest difference is that ratio data, more often than not, like just think, can I have none of this? And more often than not, that will help you to figure out whether it's ratio or interval. Hope this quick video helps. If you still have any questions, by all means, please let me know.